There are men who do not enter rooms, they occupy them. Nikolai Anisimovich Shchelokov was that kind of man. In October of 1982, he sat behind his desk on Ogarova Street, the headquarters of the Soviet Ministry of Internal Affairs. And the word that came to mind was not official. It was not even powerful. The word was inevitable. He had been sitting behind that desk for 17 years. 17 years. In the Soviet nomenclature, where ministers changed like seasons, where loyalty was rewarded with a pension and a dacha, and then quiet oblivion, 17 years at the head of the most feared domestic institution in the country was not a career. It was a dynasty. The office itself told the story before he ever spoke a word. Persian carpets, genuine ones, not the machine-made imitations distributed to party officials of lower rank, covered the floors from wall to wall. The furniture was Berlin craftsmanship, acquired in the years after the Great Victory, heavy and dark and smelling faintly of another era's grandeur. Carrara marble framed the fireplace. Paintings on the walls were not Soviet propaganda prints. They were real art, canvases that belonged in museums, that in fact had come from museums. This was not an office, this was a declaration. Every object in that room said the same thing in a different language. I am untouchable. And for 17 years he had been exactly that. How does a man reach such heights? The question sounds simple. The answer is not. Shchelokov was born in 1910 in the Donbass, the son of a worker. He joined the Communist Party in 1931. He studied engineering. He served in the war. He governed Dnepropetrovsk. And in Dnepropetrovsk, sometime in the 1930s, he met a young party official named Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev. That meeting was worth more than any diploma, any military decoration, any political achievement that followed. Because what Shchelokov understood, what he grasped with the precision of a trained engineer, was that in the Soviet system, institutions did not protect men. Men protected men. Laws did not grant power. Relationships granted power. And the relationship between Nikolai Shchelokov and Leonid Brezhnev was not a relationship between a minister and a general secretary. It was something far older and far more dangerous. It was friendship. They hunted together at Zavidovo, in the birch forests outside Moscow, where the party elite went to forget they were mortal. Brezhnev called him Shchelokov, called him. They had known each other's families for decades. They had shared secrets that neither man ever committed to paper. And when Brezhnev became the most powerful person in the largest country on earth, he reached for the phone and called his old friend Kolya and said, I need someone I can trust at the Ministry of Internal Affairs. In 1966, Shchelokov became minister. What followed was something the Soviet Union had never quite seen before. Previous ministers of internal affairs had been instruments, functional, replaceable, careful not to cast too large a shadow. Shchelokov was something different. He built, he expanded. He transformed the Ministry of Internal Affairs from a blunt enforcement tool into something resembling an empire. Under his leadership, the police force grew to nearly 1.5 million uniformed officers. He established police academies, culture centers, museums. He funded theatrical productions. He invited writers and composers to police galas. He cultivated a public image, the humane face of Soviet law enforcement, that was so polished, so deliberately constructed, that even his critics inside the Kremlin had to admit it was masterful. And underneath that image, quietly, systematically, he built something else entirely. His wife, Svetlana Vladimirovna, was not simply a minister's spouse. She was a shadow architect of the social world that surrounded them. The banquets, the connections, the careful cultivation of relationships with artists, ambassadors, and cultural figures whose goodwill translated into soft power. His son served inside the ministry itself. His sons-in-law and nephews occupied positions throughout the system. The Shchelokov family was not a family. It was a network. And every thread of that network ran through one man's hands. In 17 years, he had received the rank of General of the Army. He held 2 orders of Lenin, He was a hero of socialist labor. He sat on the Central Committee. His portrait hung in police stations from Vladivostok to Kaliningrad. He was, by every visible measure, indestructible. But somewhere in the long corridors of Lubyanka, the headquarters of the KGB 3 kilometers from Ogareva Street, a different story was being written. His name was Yuri Vladimirovich Andropov. He had led the KGB since 1967, 1 year after Shchelokov took over the Ministry of Internal Affairs. For 15 years, these two men had operated in parallel, each commanding one of the two great power structures of the Soviet state, each watching the other with the patience of chess players who had agreed to play a very long game. Andropov did not like Shchelokov. This was not a personal sentiment. It was a professional assessment. He had seen the reports. He knew about the requisitions, the antiques, the jewelry, the state cars used for private purposes, the dacha renovations paid for by ministry funds, the painting collections, the foreign goods flowing through channels that existed only because the man at the top had decided they could exist. He had read the testimonies of the Tchaikovsky, the shadow economy operators who paid protection to officers who reported to Shchelokov. He had the phone intercepts. He had the financial records. He had been building a file for years. The file had a code name, Kozyain, the master, and Andropov understood, with the cold clarity that had made him the most effective intelligence chief in Soviet history, that the file was useless as long as one man was alive. As long as Brezhnev breathed, Shchelokov was untouchable. So Andropov waited. In October of 1982, the old general secretary was 75 years old and fading. Everyone in Moscow knew it, though no one said it aloud. Brezhnev's hands shook. His speech had thickened into something difficult to follow. He moved through his ceremonial duties like a man underwater, present in body but increasingly absent in everything else. Shchelokov sat in his marble office on Ogareva Street and watched the snow beginning to fall outside his window. He'd spent 17 years building something he believed was permanent, a career, a legacy, an empire held together by loyalty and fear and the unbreakable bond between two old men from Dnipropetrovsk. He did not know, could not know, or perhaps refused to know, that an empire built on a single man is not an empire at all. It is a countdown, and in 3 weeks the clock would reach 0. The phone rang at 8 minutes past 10 in the morning. Shchelokov was at his desk. The snow outside was heavier now than it had been the previous week. Thick, wet, the kind of Moscow snow that muffles sound and makes the city feel like it has been wrapped in a shroud. He had a cup of tea in front of him, untouched, a stack of reports. A normal morning. He picked up the receiver. The voice on the line belonged to Yevgeny Chazov, the chief physician of the 4th Main Directorate, the man responsible for the health of the Soviet leadership. Chazov spoke in the measured, clinical tone of a man who had delivered this kind of news before and had learned to strip it of all emotion. Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev was dead. The date was November 10th, 1982. Shchelokov set the receiver down. He did not speak. He looked out the window at the falling snow, and in that silence, in the space between one breath and the next, 17 years of accumulated power began invisibly and irreversibly to collapse. He did not know it yet. But somewhere across the city, in a different office behind a different desk, Yuri Andropov had already picked up a different phone and spoken 4 words to the men who had been waiting for them. Quote, quote. The funeral was a theater production on a national scale. On November 14th, the coffin of Leonid Brezhnev was carried through Red Square on a gun carriage, followed by the entire senior leadership of the Soviet Union, walking in a column through the bitter November cold. Shchelokov was in the first row of pallbearers. His place was secure. His rank demanded it. The protocol of Soviet mourning was precise and unforgiving. He wore his uniform. He carried his grief like a decoration, and he felt, as he walked, a gaze on him. He turned his head slightly, the way men do when they feel they are being observed. Andropov was walking several meters away, and for a fraction of a second, their eyes met. It was not a hostile look. It was not threatening. It was the look of a surgeon studying a patient before the first incision. Calm, focused, entirely without sentiment. Shchelokov looked away. He told himself later it had meant nothing. Men exchanged glances at funerals. It was natural. He told himself this with the confidence of a man who had spent 17 years being certain about things. He was wrong about this, as he was wrong about nearly everything that followed. The first signs were small and deliberate, surgical. In the Soviet system, power was not only measured in titles and offices. It was measured in the texture of daily life, the quality of attention you received, the speed with which your calls were returned, the number of cars in your convoy, the table reserved at the Kremlin banquets, the invitation lists, the access. These things were not incidental. They were the language in which the system communicated status, and the system had begun to speak differently to Nikolai Shchelokov. Invitations stopped arriving, not all at once, and that would have been too obvious, too crude, beneath the sophistication Andropov prided himself on. One reception, then another, a session of the Central Committee where his name appeared lower on the seating arrangement than it had the month before. A dinner at the Ministry of Defense where his chair had been moved 2 places to the left. He made phone calls. Secretaries answered. Polite, professional, offering nothing. He's in a meeting. He will call you back. The callbacks never came. Former colleagues who had known him for a decade, who had eaten at his table, who had hunted with him in the same forests where he had hunted with Brezhnev, suddenly discovered that their schedules were impossibly full, that they were traveling, that they were unwell. The language of Soviet abandonment is silence, and the silence was becoming deafening. On December 17, 1982, 37 days after Brezhnev's death, the plenum of the Central Committee made it official. Shchelokov was removed as Minister of Internal Affairs. He was not present at the session. This was itself a message. In Soviet protocol, a man of his rank would ordinarily be informed in advance, given the opportunity to prepare a dignified exit. He was not given that opportunity. The decision was announced in his absence, as if he were already a figure from a previous chapter of history that no longer required acknowledgement. His replacement was Vitaly Fedorchuk, a KGB man, Andropov's man, a signal so unmistakable it required no interpretation. In his place, Shchelokov was appointed to the position of General Inspector of the Ministry of Defense, an assignment that carried an impressive-sounding title, a modest office, no staff of consequence, no decision-making authority, no government communication line, and no future. It was the Soviet equivalent of being placed in a locked room and told to inspect it indefinitely. He went home that evening and sat in the apartment on Shchuseva Street, the enormous state-allocated apartment that had been furnished over 17 years with objects that now felt, for the first time, like evidence. And he tried to understand what had happened. He had known that transitions were dangerous. He had understood in the abstract way that powerful men understand dangers that have not yet reached them, that Brezhnev's death changed the mathematics of his position. But he had not believed, genuinely had not been able to make himself believe that it would happen this fast, this completely, this coldly. He had been wrong about his own invincibility. That is perhaps the most expensive mistake a man in his position can make. January of 1983 arrived with new instructions. The cars were first. 12 government vehicles, the black Volgas and the ZL limousine that had composed his official convoy for nearly 2 decades, were recalled to the motor pool. Technicians arrived at the apartment and disconnected the government communication terminal, the special line that connected senior officials directly to the Kremlin switchboard. His access to the Kremlin hospital was suspended. The special distribution centers, the Spetsrazpredelateli, where senior nomenclature received imported goods unavailable to ordinary citizens, closed their doors to his name. Each of these removals was individually a small thing. Collectively, they were a demolition. They were the systematic dismantling of the material reality of Soviet power, not the title, which he technically still held in his meaningless new position, but the substance, the daily texture of being a man who mattered. With each car they took, with each disconnected phone, with each closed door, The system was communicating something it had never needed to say aloud. You are no longer one of us. And then the real operation began. Andropov moved against the Ministry of Internal Affairs with the precision of a man who had been planning this moment for years. Because he had been. Investigators fanned out across the system Shchelokov had built. More than 30 generals of the ministry were called in for questioning. The Cotton Affair, the vast web of falsified production reports and extracted bribes that ran through the Soviet republics of Central Asia, was reopened and expanded, and thread by thread it was being woven toward Moscow, toward Ogareva Street, toward the man who had commanded the officers who had allowed it to flourish. Shchelokov was summoned to Lubyanka in March, not as a suspect, as a witness. The distinction was precise, deliberate, and entirely dishonest. Everyone in the room understood what he was. The investigators understood it. Shchelokov understood it, but the Soviet legal mechanism moved through its stages in sequence, and the witness stage had to precede the accused stage, and so they sat across from each other and performed the ritual with straight faces. He answered their questions. He was calm. He had been a policeman for 17 years. He knew how interrogations worked, knew the rhythms, knew when a question was genuine, and when it was a trap dressed in neutral language. He answered carefully. He gave them nothing they did not already have, but they already had more than enough. In April, they came to the apartment. 8 hours. That was how long the search lasted. 8 hours during which strangers in plain clothes moved through every room of the home he had built over 17 years, opening drawers and closets and cabinets, lifting carpets, examining paintings, cataloging objects with the methodical patience of men who knew exactly what they were looking for, because they had already been told it was there. What they found filled several evidence crates, jewelry with a combined assessed value of nearly 1 million rubles, at a time when the average Soviet monthly salary was under 200 rubles, foreign currency, antiques. Artworks removed from state museum collections, documents, more jewelry, objects that had arrived over the years through channels that existed in the space between official and criminal, in that gray zone where Soviet power had always operated, and which Shchelokov had not invented, but had certainly expanded and exploited with considerable enthusiasm. Svetlana Vladimirovna, his wife, his partner, the woman who had built the social architecture of their world, was placed under formal investigation as an accessory. She would not survive it. Within a year, she was dead. The official cause was listed as illness. Those who knew her said she simply stopped wanting to live after that April morning when strangers came and took everything apart. By the end of 1983, the world Nikolai Shchelokov had inhabited for 17 years had been disassembled piece by piece with bureaucratic thoroughness. The cars, the phones, the access, the colleagues, the title, the ministry, the wife's freedom, the family's name. He wrote letters to Andropov, formal, measured letters arguing procedural irregularities, appealing to their shared history of service, reminding the new General Secretary of precedents and regulations, to the Politburo, to Marshal Ustinov, who had been a colleague for decades, to the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet. The letters were received, registered, assigned reference numbers, and placed in files. Not a single reply came back. In the Soviet system, silence is not the absence of an answer. It is the answer. And the answer was, there is no appeal. There is no mercy. There is no one left who will pick up the phone. The man who had once commanded 1.5 million officers, who had answered only to Brezhnev and in some senses answered to no one at all, who had filled 17 years with power so completed it felt like the natural order of things. That man was sitting alone in an apartment stripped of its meaning, writing letters into a silence that stretched all the way to the horizon. The ground had not simply shifted beneath his feet. It was gone entirely. There is a specific kind of silence that descends on a man when he realizes that the institutions he served for 50 years no longer recognize his existence. It is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of erasure. By the spring of 1984, Nikolai Shchelokov had lost almost everything that had constituted his identity. The ministry, gone. The convoy, gone. The government line, gone. The colleagues, gone. The wife who had built their world with him was deteriorating in a way that medicine could not address because it was not a physical illness. The investigations were closing in from every direction simultaneously, each one feeding the others. Each arrest of a former subordinate producing new testimony, new documents, new threads that led always, inevitably, back to the man at the center. He had lost 30 kilograms in the space of 12 months. The photographs from this period, and there are very few, because a man who has been removed from history stops appearing in photographs, show someone almost unrecognizable. The broad, confident face of the minister, the face that had appeared on the covers of police journals and behind Kremlin podiums and in the hunting photographs with Brezhnev. That face was gone. What remained was older than his 74 years, hollowed out, carrying in its lines the specific exhaustion of a man who had been fighting a battle he knew he could not win but could not bring himself to stop fighting. His blood pressure swung between extremes that his doctors, the private doctors he could still access, the Kremlin hospital, having long since closed its doors to him, described in their notes with visible alarm. His hands trembled. He could not sleep for more than 2 or 3 hours at a time. He woke in the darkness of the apartment and sat with his thoughts in the way that men sit when their thoughts have become their worst enemies. He wrote more letters. He was always writing letters now. In June of 1984, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union expelled Nikolai Anisimovich Shchelokov from its membership. The proceeding was conducted by a party commission in a room that smelled of old paper and institutional gravity. Men who had sat alongside him at party congresses, who had voted alongside him on resolutions, who had shaken his hand at the end of sessions that went on for hours, these men now sat across from him and read aloud from a prepared document the charges, the violations, the abuse of office, the misappropriation of state property, the corruption of subordinates, the betrayal of public trust. He sat and listened. He had held his party membership card for 50 years. He had received it as a young man in 1931, a worker's son from the Donbass who had genuinely believed in the way that young men believe in things that have not yet had the opportunity to disappoint them, that the party represented something worth serving. 50 years of congresses and committee sessions and policy meetings and 5-year plans and the great solemn rituals of Soviet political life. All of it contained in a small red document that he had carried in his jacket pocket or his desk drawer through every decade of his adult life. When the commission chairman extended his hand across the table, Shchelokov reached into his jacket and placed the card in the man's palm. It took perhaps 3 seconds. The chairman closed his fingers around it and set it to one side without looking at it again. The session was adjourned. Shchelokov stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out of the room. He had been in that building hundreds of times. He had never walked through it feeling the floors as clearly as he felt them that afternoon, as if, without the card in his pocket, gravity itself had changed its terms. The interrogations continued through the autumn. They were not the careful, procedural conversations of the early months. Those sessions at Lubyanka where he had been called a witness and the questions had been polite fictions. These were different. The investigators came in rotation, 2 at a time, working in shifts, 6 hours, sometimes 8, without significant breaks. This was a technique with a long history in Soviet legal practice. Not the theatrical brutality of an earlier era, but something more refined and in some ways more effective. Simple, grinding, relentless fatigue. Documents were placed in front of him. Testimonies signed by men he had known for decades. General Medunov, who had governed Krasnodar under his protection, had signed. Colonel Zotov had signed. Even Yuri Turbanov, the son-in-law of Brezhnev himself, arrested the previous year in connection with the same network of investigations, had provided testimony. The circle of men who had once owed their positions to Shchelokov had become one by one the circle of men whose statements were being used to dismantle what remained of his defense. He answered questions. He disputed characterizations. He requested documentary evidence for claims he considered fabricated. He was precise, disciplined, methodical. The habits of a man who had spent 17 years on the other side of this kind of proceeding were not easily abandoned, even under these conditions. But he could feel in a way that required no legal training and no inside knowledge that the proceeding had already reached its conclusion. The testimony, the documents, the expelled party card, the strip decorations, these were not steps in a process that was still searching for an outcome. They were steps in a process that had already determined its outcome and was now simply building the formal record to support it. The arrest was coming. The trial would follow. The sentence, in a case of this magnitude against a man of this former prominence under a general secretary who had staked his anti-corruption campaign on precisely this kind of prosecution, would be severe, public, final in every sense that mattered. He knew this. He sat in his apartment in the long evenings of autumn and early winter, and he knew it with a certainty that left very little room for anything else. On December 12th, 1984, a formal summons arrived from the office of the Prosecutor General of the Soviet Union. The language was official and correct and entirely transparent in its meaning. He was required to appear the following morning. Charges would be formally presented. His legal status would change at that moment from witness to accused. After that, the process had only one direction. He set the document on his desk and looked at it for a long time. Then he sat down and began to write. He wrote to his children. He wrote to his surviving family members. He addressed a final letter to the Central Committee of the Communist Party, not as a plea, not as an appeal, but as a statement of record, as a man who had served the party for 50 years and wished in the final hours of his ability to speak for himself to place his version of events alongside the official version that would outlast him. What he wrote in those letters has never been fully disclosed. Fragments have appeared over the years in the accounts of journalists and historians who spoke with family members, with former colleagues, with officials who had access to documents that were not entirely destroyed. The letters describe by all accounts not the guilt-ridden confession of a man who accepted the verdict against him, but the carefully constructed argument of a man who believed, or needed to believe, that history would eventually judge the matter differently than the men currently in control of history wished it to be judged. He wrote through the evening. He wrote past midnight. When he was finished, he set the letters in order on the desk. The morning of December 13th, 1984, was cold and clear. Moscow in December carries that particular quality of winter light that is almost blue, thin, precise without warmth, illuminating everything without softening anything. At 8:15 in the morning, on the veranda of the apartment, Nikolai Anisimovich Shchelokov, General of the Army, former Minister of Internal Affairs of the Soviet Union, former member of the Central Committee, former hero of socialist labor, the man who had commanded 1.5 million officers, the man who had hunted with Brezhnev and called him Leonya and been called Kolya in return, the man who had held a party card for 50 years and an empire for 17, made the last decision of his life. The criminal case against him was closed the same day. There would be no trial. What does this story mean? It is easy to read it as simple moral arithmetic. A corrupt official receiving what corrupt officials deserve. It is easy and it is wrong, or at least it is radically incomplete. Because the truth of Nikolai Shchelokov is not that he was innocent. He was not innocent. The antiques and the jewelry and the state cars used for private hunting trips and the protection extended to the shadow economy operators who paid for it. These things were real. He was guilty of what they accused him of. The system he ran was saturated with the corruption that the system itself had made not only possible but necessary. But here's the question that the official version of this story does not want asked. How many of the men who destroyed him were clean? How clean were the hands that assembled the file labeled Kozyain? How clean were the investigators who sat across from him for 8 hours at a time, asking questions about misappropriated antiques in an institution whose own history of acquisition made his office look like a provincial thrift store? How clean was the system that expelled him from the party? The same party that had presided over and benefited from and in many cases actively organized the very structures of privilege and corruption that Shchelokov was now being prosecuted for inhabiting? The answer, of course, is that this was never truly about cleanliness. This was about power, about the oldest and most fundamental transaction in Soviet political life. When a patron dies, his clients are exposed. Shchelokov's power had exactly one foundation: the friendship of one man. Not institutions, not law, not his own political base. One man, one relationship, one life. When that life ended on November 10th, 1982, everything Shchelokov had built became, overnight, a target rather than a fortress. Andropov did not destroy Shchelokov because Shchelokov was corrupt. He destroyed him because Shchelokov was Brezhnev's man, and Brezhnev was dead, and the new era required a symbolic sacrifice, someone whose fall would signal to the entire nomenclature that the old rules no longer applied, that the new order was serious, that the long, comfortable afternoon of the Brezhnev years was over. Shchelokov was not chosen because he was the most guilty man in the Soviet Union. He was chosen because he was the most visible, the most powerful, and the most politically useful. There is a pattern in Soviet history that repeats itself with the regularity of a law of nature. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the greatest military commander in the history of the Soviet Union, the man who broke the Wehrmacht's spine, was stripped of his command and exiled to a military backwater by Khrushchev in 1957, accused of fostering a __5___ around himself. The same Khrushchev who had made the accusation had himself been installed, in part, by Zhukov's political support. Konstantin Rokossovsky, another of the great commanders, a man who had survived Stalin's prisons to lead Soviet armies to Berlin, was sent back to Poland after the war, removed from the Soviet military mainstream, a figure to be honored at ceremonies and ignored in corridors. Vyacheslav Molotov, Foreign Minister Stalin's right hand, the man whose signature appeared on the documents that shaped the 20th century, spent his final decades as a pensioner in Moscow, stripped of his party membership, eventually rehabilitated only in the last year of his life, as a gesture so small it was almost insulting. The pattern is not complex. In a system where power flows entirely from personal connection rather than institutional structure, the fall of the patron is the fall of the client. There are no independent foundations. There are no protected positions. There's only the warmth of the sun as long as the sun is shining, and then the cold when the sun goes down. Shchelokov understood this pattern. He had observed it from positions of power over 17 years. As others fell through its mechanism, he had perhaps believed that his particular friendship was different enough, deep enough, long enough to be exempt from the rule. No friendship in that system was ever exempt. His grave is in Kuntsevo Cemetery in Moscow. It is unmarked by anything resembling official recognition. No state ceremony accompanied his burial. No government representatives were present. The decorations he had earned, the orders of Lenin, the hero's star, the ranks accumulated over 40 years of service, had been stripped posthumously, as if the state wished to reach back through time and unmake the man entirely. He was 74 years old. He had served the Soviet state for half a century, and in the end, the Soviet state had no use for him that was greater than the use of his destruction. This is not the story of a villain. It is not the story of a hero. It is the story of a system that rewarded loyalty with power and punished the end of usefulness with annihilation. A system that created men like Shchelokov as surely as it destroyed them, that needed them to exist and then needed them to fall, that could not function without corruption and could not survive without occasionally making an example of the corrupt. The Soviet state devoured its own builders, not always, not randomly, but when the political moment required it, with an efficiency and a thoroughness that should disturb anyone who believes that systems of absolute power are capable of justice. Nikolai Shchelokov built his empire on one man's friendship. When that man died, the empire lasted 37 days. And on a cold December morning, in the thin blue light of a Moscow winter, the last man standing in the ruins of that empire made the only choice he believed was still his to make. He chose the moment of his own ending. In a system that had taken everything else from him, that was the one thing they had not yet managed to confiscate.